Kofi. A very good day to the leadership and the chairman of the Network for Intercessors for Africa, Barrister Emeka Nkwankwa, to the trustees, and also the leadership of Intercessors for Africa. I normally see them from very far when I attend some of the African House of Prayer sessions that happen across the continent, and I'm really honored to be one of the panel members today. Also to the Board of Trustees and the Salt Institute family, to those who recommended me for this, Aunt Linda Gobodo, I'm not sure if she's here today, but she's the one who recommended me to, I think, Dr. Alabo. And thank you so much to her just for the referral and to a very warm welcome. We normally at the development finance side at the business school do case studies on African Development Bank and also some of the things that are happening on the continent. Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, I am honored to be on the panel together with you on this platform. Madam Alan Kajina, it is an honor to be here with tried and tested veterans on the continent. And I'm really learning, but I will share some insights that I can share from my very limited experience. My response to the president of the African Development Bank is this: we need to ask ourselves, he has announced today that there is a capital increase of approximately $115 billion. Will we be using that? This is the question, to transform our continent. The second question I want us to consider and ponder on what he has come with today is, are we going to direct our capital to the appropriate reforms to restructure our primary sector-led economies and generally very low value added exports towards building local capabilities sufficiently? And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail a little bit later on with the minimal time that I have. We chose just now with the polls. Most of us said, in line with the African Development Bank's high five of feeding and industrialization, we mostly chose industrialization as a basic requirement to improving the livelihoods of our people. But are we actually moving in that direction sufficiently? And I believe that in line with the topic of today, stewardship with integrity is a necessary condition for transformation if we are going to transform this continent. The stewardship of the abundant minerals and resources we have, that is what's going to result in Africans flourishing. And you'll see the facts. We have the minerals. We have the resources. In fact, God has been so blessed to bless every country with something. There is no country that has nothing in their hands. And I think stewardship within our leadership is what will result in the multiplication of the existing resources. We don't need additional resources. We actually have what we need in our hands for the benefit of all of our people. And I agree with both speakers. Madam Kajina put it forth that we are called to govern, to multiply, and to be effective, take governance over the resources we've been given. And I believe that leadership that multiplies should be a non-negotiable for the development of African people. And I believe in order to do this, there is something that the Lord impressed in my heart to write called A New Wine into New Wineskin, an alternative economic strategy for the development of South Africa's economy. I believe that this applies across the continent, the 7 pillars, and I'll share some of them today. And I've seen some of the comments that have come in that talk to how can we put some of the things into action? How can we put some of the suggestions into practice? And I believe we need to have a plan. And I think every country, everyone representing the different Francophone nations, Anglophone nation, Southern, Eastern, Central African, Northern African economies here, we have to look at the 7 strategic pillars, put a plan in place, execute. There is a scripture that really was impressed in my heart when I wrote this, and it says, no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine bursts the wineskins. The wine is spilled and the wineskins are ruined, but new wine must be put into new wineskin. So I'm going to share the presentation, which is not a long presentation because I know we're slightly over time. So I'm going to go into the key points that I want, and I'll probably skip some of them. This was something that I wrote with Prof. Swilling. There was a team of economists, but really what was pressed in my heart is there are problems in South Africa. I come from South Africa. We have the highest unemployment, the highest Gini index. We have the highest HIV. We are leading in the wrong things. And the Lord impressed in my heart from a very young age that the solutions will come from the church. The solutions will come from believers. The solution will come from those He has put His Spirit in. And one of the problems that I was positioned to respond to was this issue of economic reconstruction. And I found that if there is no plan put in place, what then do we do? What is it that we must implement to go forward? And this is the paper that is available online, by the way, that has been put forward for the economic reconstruction of South Africa. And I'm going to share some of the points which I think cover some of the AFDB's high fives, I believe cover some of the goals that we need to reconfigure and review as a nation and as a continent. I always do a diagnostic assessment. What does that mean? Go like Nehemiah, assess what is happening. Where are you? What is happening from an economic perspective? I'm an economist and I focus usually on these indices. What is happening with unemployment? On the continent right now, we know we have 9% unemployment, but the continent is not homogeneous. So we know that different countries have different levels of unemployment. But we know majority of those who are affected by unemployment across the board is the youth. At almost 20% of our unemployed people are youth who are not in education nor in training. Only 46% of our people are in the labor force. So the labor force participation rate, it tells you how much of your people that are economically active between 15 and 64 are actually in the economy, participating and actually being able to absorb into different sectors. So our economic growth model across the continent shows you that whatever we have done, whatever the policies we have had, we've heard Dr. Adesina mention the problem of unemployment that is being accentuated by COVID. But this was a fundamental flaw in our system even prior to COVID, which leads us to a very high poverty rate, 34% poverty rate. This in numbers means that you have 429 million Africans in poverty. That's living on less than $1 a day. COVID has added 38.7 million to this, giving us 465 million Africans in poverty. These are livelihoods. These are people with children. These are young men and women who are affected on how to live day to day. One of the key enablers to measuring whether or not you're able to improve the livelihood of your people, usually GDP or gross domestic product, is a measure to try and see whether you can deal with poverty, unemployment, and all the other human development indices. And we have heard today that we have contracted by the largest contraction of 2.1% in the last year because of COVID, and we are sitting at a 3.4% growth in terms of economic output. So the question that we had, and I think Madam Kajina said, it cannot be business as usual. It cannot be business as usual with Dr. Adesina, who has given us a very clear framework of how to recover post-COVID, but also what the continent needs to do. And I think that we've got to prevent the free fall. In order for us to do that, we've got to look at some of the key issues. Africa is inundated with blessing. There is no country. Look at the bottom from South Africa's gold, all the way to the tea of Eastern Africa, to the coffee, to the grain, to the livestock of the Sudanese and the Ethiopians. We're seeing that there's copper in the central part, crude oil in Angola, platinum, uranium, oil. Oil reserves are en masse. Cotton, iron ore. There is nothing that we do not have that we have not been blessed with as a continent. But the question we need to ask ourselves is, are we sufficiently translating this to the betterment of the livelihoods of our people? Many of these are crude minerals that I'm talking about. Some of them are agricultural foodstuffs. But the regulation, the duties, the permit are primarily geared towards large-scale, capital-intensive, multinational-driven type of development. We're preoccupied with foreign direct investment. I'm not against FDI, but I think that the manner in which we drive industrialization, the manner in which we drive particularly manufacturing, requires us to look and to consider alternatives. We've got to look at small scale, and I'm focusing on mining in these points, small scale artisanal mining. It's not an impediment, but I would say it's an alternative. So when we talk about and look at these products that you see here that are blessed across the continent. Many of our countries have up to 80% of our exports coming from one resource being exported, non-refined, non-processed, raw, in its raw form, because this is the current status quo, which leads us to some of the underdevelopment outcomes that we have seen. We've got to have innovation. If we are going to support, so I'm proposing that in our endeavors to grow, whether it's in agriculture, whether it's in mining, whether it's in manufacturing, the model that we make use of as an alternative is to consider small scale, whether it's artisanal mining, whether it's artisanal manufacturing at a local level. We've got to mechanize operations for small scale miners, small scale manufacturers, small scale food processors, using innovation. So mechanization, digital technology. We heard about cash payments. We've seen what's happened in Kenya with M-Pesa. That is innovation. All of these are enablers for people to have market access, but also to access finance. These catalyze our ability to come out of the quagmire we're in. We've got to catalyze our local purchasing power. So we've got to look beyond what we call the trickle-down effect, where we think that big companies that are in the urban areas are going to necessarily change what is happening in the many of our rural and our peri-urban nodes. I believe that as an alternative, catalyzing local manufacturing, local economic development, local mining, these improve your local purchasing power. That money stays within that region. It multiplies across the people within that region. It goes around 7 times, and you'll see the further development of your MSMEs or SMMEs, and you'll be able to grow your economy. People will get jobs. Money will stay within our small businesses. You'll start to see the improvement of the livelihoods of people. An example of the inhibiting factor is prospective and exploration licensing fees for you to enter into any of these sectors. We know that there's mineral goods in our countries, but to enter, you likely are expected to pay up to $500,000 to actually simply have prospective licenses or even explore. And this is an inhibitor. And I think that from a policy side, and those who are here on a policy side, we've got to say, how do we review these things so that we can enable access to our people rather than forcing ourselves, because of the fees that we put in place, excluding our local people, excluding even Africans themselves from exploring and being prospective owners of these minerals that we have been inundated and blessed with. Have we ever considered an OPEC for minerals? Have we as a continent ever considered that the Arabs, they control the prices of oil? They are able to manipulate and rather, they are able to influence the supply of oil, thereby influencing the price. We, on the other hand, are left to the markets. Commodity prices go up and down based on the markets. We don't have an OPEC for platinum. We don't have an OPEC for gold, diamonds, cobalt, crude oil. Okay, there is one for oil, but these other very important minerals that we extract, we are left to the mercy of the market. And I'm proposing that we need to look at, and possibly with the African Development Bank, to look at ways where we can begin to control the supply of our products, thereby having an influence on the price of our commodities because they are our commodities. We also need a blueprint for artisanal and community-driven initiatives. And so this is one of the blueprints that I would say, if we are going to extract benefit from some of these goods that God has given and naturally endowed Africa with, we've got to look at all these things so that our people benefit. Taking us a little bit back, this is in Mali, modern day Mali now, this is in Timbuktu. We used to be the place where we were a commercial and an academic center 200 years before Christ came. We used to be this trans-Saharan trade, the place where people came, not just for academia, not just for commerce. People go to Harvard now and Oxford, but they used to come to Timbuktu. But we were also the center for trade. I know that the African Continental Free Trade arrangement is going to propel us to greater heights if we use it, right? But 500 AD, we were the exporters of salt. We were the exporters of gold. We were the exporters of ivory. Many in Asia would come to this part of the continent, different parts of the continent, whether it was Southern Africa for ivory, gold from the western parts and the northern parts, and there was salt being mined. We were the Philips, the DeFi, the refrigerator of the world because we had salt mines. And I'm saying that the wealthiest people came from the African continent. The people of Africa were all living well and large in their communities, governing themselves well. And we need to go back to that type of wellness and high living standards. Scholarship used to be sought after on the continent. Maths, science, arts, these are not things that came from Europe. We sometimes think that many of our scholarship issues came from Europe, or matters of scholarship material for maths and science. In fact, many of them, if you were to research, they came from the continent. I want to encourage us a little bit before I hit you hard here with some facts. This is UNCTAD looks at the least developed economies in the world. Where do you see the concentration? Africa. Where do you see the hub? There's 47 countries in the least developed countries of the world. Of those, 70% are in Africa. And surprisingly, the fastest growing economies, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Tanzania, these are growing between 5, 7, 8% growth, are sitting within this LDC monitor as at the time when this was revealed. And so the question that I have is, growth alone doesn't necessarily take away underdevelopment. And it's very important for us to understand. It's important to have economic growth, but economic growth that doesn't change the quality of life is something then that we need to revisit and review and see, how can we therefore have growth that ensures that we have development and not continued underdevelopment irrespective of the growth. So what do we employ given the current unemployment, given the current poverty, given the current underdevelopment? What are the necessary conditions to transforming these outcomes? I'm going to skip these slides because all they show you is really where the growth comes from. This tells you that growth comes from the big 5 economies. The gray area shows you the smaller economies, the other 46 in Africa outside of these 5. You see that the biggest are Nigeria, Morocco, Egypt, Algeria, and South Africa in the orange and in the blue and maroon. These economies do shift the economic output of the regions that they are primarily in. We also know, which is very important that I want to focus on here, is where does our economic output come from? The majority of our economic output you'll see here is from private consumption. And I take this from the African Development Bank, which does an annual economic outlook of the continent. And you see here that the green shows you that since 2010, we see the majority of our output comes from consumption. Africans consume. You see that our ability to trade and export goods that we have processed in many of the years, 2013, 2015, is actually negative. That means we import more than we export. It affects our trade deficits. It affects our current account surpluses negatively. But the important thing is we've got to, when we look at this issue of developing the continent, let us be honest with where we are. Let us be honest, and integrity for me speaks to being able to face the reality of where we are. And the reality of where we are is after consumption, the second biggest contribution to our economic output is investment. This investment we have seen over the last couple of years, if you look to the right here, it goes largely into services-led sector, followed by, depending on which year you're looking at, but towards the outer years, you're seeing that industry and agriculture are somewhat approximately around 20%, depending on the country. Agriculture to a less extent, less than 20%. But you're seeing the majority of the investment is directed towards your services sector. Now, the problem that you have in this is that the kind of development within the services sector, that we call it the tertiary sector, your finance, your real estate, your retail sector, is that it requires a highly professional body of people, in the sense that the skills that are required in that sector is not the same as the primary sector. The majority of our economies have low skill or semi-skilled labor, which are mainly employed here in the industry. And the industry is where you really, if you want to develop and grow your capabilities, is the need for the focus. So what I would propose, if we as leaders, if we as Africans want to transform, if the youth want to be innovative, the focus should be in industry and agriculture. The focus should be on processing within agriculture so that you can export. Look at the exports here. You see that talks to the level of trade that Africa is currently doing with the rest of the world. And you can see there it's just a microcosm equal to what the government spends. So in terms of trade, and if you compare us with newly industrialized economies, you see there that China, this is talking to your emerging market per capita GDP, China and India, per capita GDP and the growth of their GDP talks to the quality of life of their people. They've been able, because of the focus on industry, of the focus of feeding their own people, on the focus of localization of production, they've been able to outperform most of their global counterparts. And they've been able to take 400 million people out of poverty. By the way, that's the same 465 million people that we have in this continent currently living in poverty. So we're not necessarily seeing an improvement of the people of Africa's livelihoods as much as we want to, irrespective of some of our countries having the fastest growing economies in the world. On inequality, we see here most of our African economies on the Gini index are facing very high level of inequality. This means that there is a small minority of people who have all the wealth and income in most of our countries. The top 10% decile. The top 10% usually have approximately 60 to 90% of the wealth. And so there's no real spread and distribution. And I'm going to offer some of the solutions here in the alternative framework. By the way, yes, that is South Africa again here with the worst. And I sometimes ask myself, Lord, why is it that we have the most developed, but we have all these issues? Just like Madam Kajina, I ask myself, why am I even a South African sometimes? But I know the Lord has placed me here so that we can resolve some of the fundamental issues and some of the complex problems that we have inherited. And I believe God places us where we are placed primarily because of that. He sets your boundaries because he wants you to solve. If you ask yourself, why are you in Cote d'Ivoire? Why are you in Ethiopia? Why am I in Malawi? I don't want to be in Nigeria. No, you must stay there because you have been placed there by God so that you can solve the problem of Tunisia, of Zimbabwe, and Sudan. That is where you must stay. What is the alternative? So we know what's happened in the globe. And I like this cartoon because it shows what we see on the continental and the global perspective. So we didn't reach the 8 Millennium Development Goals. That was in 2015. So what we do is, let's double them. Let's make them 17. We're going to 2030. Let's spread the timelines. I'm not sure whether we'll miss or we'll get to the targets, but I hope we will. But the timeline is now 2030. We've doubled the goals, but that's just the short brief. But the strategic interventions that I suggest in the New Wine into New Wine Skin alternative framework are here. We've got to industrialize. We have got to industrialize as a key growth driver. We've got to adopt labor absorbing strategies and prioritize sectors. And you've got to look at your country-specific planning because countries are not homogenous. You've got to look at how to use state procurement, particularly in the lower income countries and the lower to middle income countries on the continent. We have to boost domestic food production. I'm very encouraged by what the African Development Bank is doing. I'm very encouraged by what they're doing with African women and AFAWA, because many of our rural homesteads, of our rural areas have masses of land because these are the inheritance we've been given. We've been given land. Our people are migrating to towns and cities, and yet we have the very asset that many of the people in this world are looking for. We must instead revisit and rethink, how are we stewards over the land that we have been given? We've got to have rural development, and this requires the state to decisively enable, road infrastructure, transport infrastructure, electrification, which is an enabler towards you developing your key sectors. These are the 4 on domestic resource mobilization. Many of the time we want to go and borrow money, and yet we have domestic resources. We've got to use our fiscal stimulus strategically, and our state, which many of us may not be in, has to build capacity and growing through redistribution. These are discussed extensively in the paper. I won't go into detail because of time, but I think that economic development must have local productivity enhancement agricultural productivity enhancement, making sure that these are non-negotiable. If we are going to improve our national incomes, these are non-negotiables. We've got to have national firms that are national champions. Where are the believers that are coming up with instruments and companies that are going to begin to enter into those sectors and be supported using the existing initiatives to be national firms, national champions? Why? Because you've been given what you need in that local area. And I believe with faith, God can multiply whatever it is that you have in that area to begin to be a solution. We've got to reform our value chains and distribution channels. Many of our countries have 2, 3, 4 companies controlling big industries, and they operate like cartels. They kick out any new entrant. They behave like oligopolies. They don't want new entrants, but we've got to fight to enter. These barriers must be removed. If we must pray until these barriers are removed, then so be it. If we must fast and pray until these monopolistic structures are dismantled, because that is the authority you have in prayer. If there are monopolies that need dismantling in your country, you've got to stand steadfast as a unit so that we have new entrants and many of those new entrants so that the economy is a shared economy. We've got to transform the factors of production. So this talks to the access to land, to capital, and to human capital development. We cannot have a growth of any economy without the youth being developed, without the youth being capacitated. I want to say to the youth that are here today, look at vocational education as a way into business. Let's not look down on using our hands for development of our countries. If you look at how Germany, as an example of a country that was decimated after World War II, they are the leaders in vocational education. They are the leaders in one of the largest economies in the world today, and yet 50, 60 years ago, there was nothing. This is because they are very key in understanding the value of using the hands and the value of vocational education and the value of not looking down on the artisanal capabilities of their people. Agriculture as a basis, and I'm going to almost close. One of the last things that I want to talk about is domestic food production. Agriculture as a basis for manufacturing. There are various industries and sub-industries and classifications. Many of the food products that we see that are in our countries today, we import. The food that we have, we import. The beverages, the paper products, the wood, the things that are in your homes, the chairs you're sitting on today, the laptops that you're watching from, the cell phones that you're watching this, how many of those are localized? How many of those are produced locally? And I think that we've got to revisit how we can reconfigure producing many of the things that we use day to day locally. How can you contribute to that? What is your role in that? And that is a question of your destiny and your calling, and revisiting and asking the Lord, what is it that you have put me on this earth to do? How can I contribute to this? Perhaps it may not be within the sphere of domain. Maybe you're in education, maybe you're in government. But if you are called in this domain and you're waiting, God is actually looking to you to be the producer and the manufacturer and to bring out the best of your economy. Self-sufficiency has to be something that we as a people begin to look for. We cannot rely on other countries. And COVID has really shown us that countries can actually not be able to ship goods because economies simply can be closed down. What then? If you cannot import basic foodstuffs, you yourselves, yet you have land, you have water, you have capabilities, you have human capacity, you have more than 1.2 billion Africans on the continent. Why are you not able to develop your own goods? In the section 733 in the paper, we actually propose alternative rural development and localizing of food. What do we export to the rest of the world? You see here, almost 70% of what we export is mineral products that are raw, metals, stone, glass, and mineral products. This speaks to the problem that we have in the continent where we are simply not reconfiguring. By the way, this is from UNCTAD 2 years ago. So this is not necessarily telling you old things, but rather what is happening now. How much of what we make is from footwear, textiles? Remember, 70% of the cotton in the world probably comes from this continent. How much of it is in textiles that are processed? We export only 4% of the total of the African continent. wood and wood products. How much timber comes from the different parts of the continent? 1% is what we export globally. Look at the amount of livestock we have, but how much are we exporting to other parts of the world? 1% of the total. This is showing you that we are not sufficiently putting emphasis on this. And what are the requirements for us to begin to reconfigure ourselves as a continent in this regard? So I think that, yes, we see that Ethiopia has grown substantially well. We're seeing the DRC, Congo is growing substantially well. These are the fastest growing countries in the world. But if you go to the least developed countries that are reported, they're also there. All of these countries, I was actually surprised. So what you're seeing is that, yes, they are growing fast. This is a compounded average growth rate you see is over 7%. This means that they're growing as fast as China. But what it says is that you've got to have industrialization, redistribution, and localization of production, particularly on agriculture, you're going to get the gains. A concern on the continent is our debt levels. There is a scripture that says that those who are borrowers are slaves to those whom they borrow money to. And I believe that a lot of the problem that we have, reason why we have so much influence on the continent is because we continue to borrow unabated. There is no limit to how much we want to borrow on the continent. And I think that if we are leaders who are good stewards, we've got to look at how to review this issue of public debt. We've seen it in around 2010, we're sitting at very low levels compared to where we are now. 31% to sitting now at around 70%. Almost more than doubling our debt to GDP ratios across the continent. Even though we have financing needs, I believe that we've got to think carefully about how do we borrow. By the way, an interesting phenomenon in the last few years is that a third of the debt is owed to Chinese creditors, 10% alone to the Chinese Development Bank. And the Chinese government and banks have lent 143 billion to Africa in the last 20 years. And my question is, are we not going to become slaves and the next generation will have difficulty in doing what they need to do because of this amount of money that is now owed to the different development banks, even the Chinese government that has lent to us? I think we need to carefully think about these things. In conclusion, if we want to see a different vision and a different outcome, we've got to do things differently. We've got to implement things that will result in change. We've got to implement alternative policy reforms that can model and show that they will have a positive impact on job creation, on unemployment, on the livelihoods of our people, but more importantly, reducing decisively this poverty issue that we have on the continent. Income inequality must be lessened, and the modeling that we do within the new wine into new wine skins actually includes this. And these are some of the graphs and the econometrics that we've done to try and show if we implement these policy reforms, what is the effect against the baseline on investment, on household consumption, on GDP, on exports, on our debt to GDP levels. We want to see these go down. So what I'm saying is, if we are going to plan well as Africans, as I close, if we are going to plan differently, if we are going to get to the Africa that Dr. Adesina and Madam Kajina spoke about, we have to be those who avail ourselves to be used by the Lord. My last point is really to say that we are the ones that God wants to use in these last days. It was Joseph and Esther that came to the national altar with solutions. It was David and Deborah that rose up and were the answer. God is looking for no one else but you. Nehemiah, as an example, he rebuilt the broken walls and he restored and brought economic justice. He brought relief to the poor. If our leaders bring change, they must also bring relief to the poor. I want to say to the youth today, I'm in my 30s. I never imagined I'd be on such a platform in my 30s, speaking with such eminent leaders. You are called. God wants you to use your gift in the area you've been called to. Do not despise your youth. Be an example. The Bible speaks of how you must be an example in word and deed and faith and purity. Joseph was in his 30s when he was appointed after coming out of jail. Jesus was in his 30s when he revolutionized our faith and gave his life for you and I. Esther was very young, Jeremiah, mere youths. So don't count yourself out in providing solutions. Those in the professional space, God has called you to rebuild. And the question I ask is, what are you rebuilding? It may be manufacturing hubs that you are supposed to rebuild, that God is looking you to rebuild, food production hubs, the new brands that must still come from Africa, farming products, mining hubs. There are so many. But the question is, have you availed yourself as an instrument in the hands of the Lord? To families, I look at families and always see the story of Moses in the Bible and see how God used one family to change the entire generation that was coming. Nehemiah, when he rebuilt the wall, he didn't rebuild it alone. There were families that were actually rebuilding different parts of the wall. And I will encourage us, as we are in different families, what are our families doing to contribute to the rebuilding? God is the God of families. God is looking to the body of Christ, like Joseph, to build repositories. I believe God is going to do an amazing thing in this continent. I believe God is going to use us who have faith, because it takes faith to do the things that Joseph did. He believed what he saw in dreams. He believed that God could do what he said he could do. Do you believe? Do you believe that God is able to transform your country and your economy? I believe he can do it. And I believe he can use you, he can use me, but he only requires that you be willing. So I speak life over the continent, and I believe that this is really an amazing session for us to really review and to reinvigorate and to I'd say, align ourselves to whatever it is that the Lord wants to do in this continent, avail ourselves to be salt, as this is a salt leadership public lecture. Our communities need us to be salt, and I bless you all, and thank you so much for having me.